Hi, everyone. Happy Women's History Month. My name is Tanya Roth. I am a teacher at a high school in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm the author of Her Cold War, Women in the U.S. Military, 1945 to 1980. I'm so excited to be here today with you all to talk to Professor Sarah Perry Myers. She's an associate professor of history at Messiah University, and today she'll be talking to us about her book, Earning Their Wings, The WASPs of World War II. She teaches courses on 20th century U.S. history, gender, public history, and military history. Dr. Myers received dialogues on the experience of war grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which focused on generating dialogue with female veterans in particular. Her works appeared in several edited collections released by Palgrave Macmillan and Routledge, and her book, the one we'll talk about today, Earning Their Wings, The WASPs of World War II and Their Fight for Veteran Recognition, recently came out from University of North Carolina Press. It explores the history of the women Air Force service pilots, a really fascinating group of women in World War II, and we're so excited to get to talk to her today about this. Welcome, Dr. Myers.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to have this conversation. The format of this program is going to be that I'm going to talk about the book a little bit and give you some context of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. And then Tanya and I are going to have a back and forth conversation about the role of women during the war and in later years with their organizing. I want to first say thank you so much for spending time. Everyone's time is valuable, so thank you for taking the time to watch this screening. And I also really want to thank the National Archives for not only this invitation, but for the research that I used to write this book. The National Archivists are amazing humans who help all of us historians so much. So I wanted to definitely be sure to, give all of you a large thank you. I am going to share my screen here and start a presentation with you all so that you can get some background context information. All right, so this is the book. It's Earning Their Wings, and it looks at this larger history of women in flights. So the years prior to World War II, who is flying, how are they earning their pilot's licenses? And then I look at the WASP program specifically during the wartime years that I'm going to focus on for this talk. And I look at their organization to try to fight for veteran status. The reason why these women are unique is because they are the only women's unit during World War II that did not receive military status. So what that means is during the course of the war, the Congress made decisions about who was granted military status. And so they granted it to the other women's units in the Women Marines, the women in the Army Corps, the women in the Navy, etc. And for the WASP, that's going to create a unique story and situation for them. So these women pilots are passionate about flying in the decades prior to World War II. This is a quote from one of the women who become the WASP. Her name is Cornelia Fort. She was in among the first 28 women who were a part of these wartime military flying programs. And this quote really captures how much these women love to fly. And so she talks about how she was happiest at the sky at dawn when the quietness of the air was like a caress. And she goes on to explain this like beautiful picture for us of how much she loves flying and flight in particular. It's just something that all the women shared. So these women received the same training during World War II as men, with the exception of combat training. So this is a photograph from Life magazine in 1943, where the women are sitting in ground school classes. They learn everything from how to take apart an engine to navigation, to physics, etc. And in this training, they're prepared to fly different versions of American aircraft from primary to basic to advanced. After training, they are then assigned on bases across the continental United States. This is a staged publicity photo, but I really like how it shows the women in the two different versions of their uniforms, because during World War II, women were perceived as controversial for their military roles, and the WASP were very much a reflection of that, particularly because these are women who not only are in new and expanding roles during the war, but also who are performing work that is in no way considered to be traditional for women, because they are literally, flying planes and flying alongside male pilots on the home front. So among their assignments, you see them ferrying planes from factories to bases. So as they're produced in factories, they're then taken to military bases so that they can be taken overseas or used for other training purposes. With all of this wartime flying, women consistently talk about their interest in, flying as a career, but also flying in the military specifically. One of the things that kind of captures the difference between civilian and military flight is this quote by one of the WASP, Lillian Yonley. In this quote, she says, "When you take off its power, when you push the throttle forward and it pushes you right back into the seat and you go on up, it's beautiful up there. It's a very special feeling." The WASP all talk about this, how flying these larger, you know, if it's a bomber plane or faster planes like pursuit aircraft, that flying at high altitudes was not only like the beauty of flight for them, like Cornelia Fort talked about, but also something that makes them feel a sense of empowerment and also beauty for the profession. One of the really fascinating assignments given to the WASP was that of towing targets. So if you look at the picture on the left, it shows you one of the WASP flying with this target attached by cables to the back of her plane. This is, the picture's taken from the perspective of a photographer here, so you see a journalist taking this. But women were practicing this maneuver in the sky. So basically, they flew in the same formation, like back and forth repetitively in a very precise way so that men on the ground with the image you see on the right could practice shooting anti-aircraft artillery at these targets. So they're literally shooting, live ammunition at these targets, but then they also have men in the skies who are practicing combat by, using pursuit aircraft to fly and shoot bullets at this target. Men also performed this assignment. So this was something given to men and women who were serving in the Army Air Force on the home front. But what's unique about this is that it, disrupts ideas about protection and who is protected during a time of war and who's put in a position of risk or danger. And in particular, what you see happen is when women hold this position, so when they're given this assignment by the Army Air Force, they are literally like performing not only dangerous work, but work that male pilots feel a little bit resentful of. And some of the pilots, male pilots that they're flying with, are actually going to ask for other assignments because they start to, diminish or demean these women's roles by calling target towing chores, quote unquote, or saying that this is like repetitive, tedious work that is better suited for women. And again, like this is highly dangerous. It requires a high level of skill. And so it's interesting that male pilots are reacting to this way to women entering into new roles. But also some pilots, quite frankly, in discussions that I can't talk, General Arnold has with the commanding general of the Army Air Force, is that they say like we would rather die overseas than at home. And so there are men and women who die towing targets. That is not from ammunition, actually, but rather from the planes that these people are flying, because you don't want to fly a plane that's in good condition. And so you're flying older planes, planes that have been like repaired or sometimes hastily repaired. And so there are going to be WASP, but also male pilots who die towing targets for these reasons that are outside of their control and have to do with the aircraft that they're flying. The WASP are organized as military, though. So I said earlier that Congress decides not to grant them military status, but they're organized with the intention of that. So the Army Air Force assumes that just like other women's units, that this is going to be militarized. So they issue, as you can see here, one of my favorite WASP who I interviewed, I put her on the left. She's one of my favorites just because she was literally the second one that I interviewed and the first one that I ever contacted. But they show in these pictures that they're wearing military uniforms, that they've been issued by the government. They're issued dog tags. They take the same oath, same training. They are given the same type of assignments on the home front. They're subject to the exact same rules. So they have to, request military leave when they're on a base. They, unlike other civilians on base who can just come and go, they have to request leave. So everything about them is organized in with the assumption that they'll eventually be military. What you see happen, though, is because Congress decides not to grant them military status is that when you have 38 WASP who died during the war, this is a photo on the right from some of the WASP annual reunions that they have in Sweetwater, Texas, which is the site where they trained during the war. When they're at these reunions, they always have a memorial service for the 38 women who lost their lives during the war. Those accidents happened for a variety of reasons that mirror male pilot accidents on the home front, where you see things that are the result of weather, that are a result of the aircraft that they're flying, all these different varied factors, sometimes because of new technologies. The image on the left is actually from a newsletter that the WASP created during the war. This is a very similar practice that male pilots, but also men in other units had, where they would write these newsletters for themselves for distribution. And it was a way to maintain their culture and maintain connections in the midst of a war effort. And so on the left, you see one of the WASP who was a trainee who died during training. And on the right is a memorial for her instructor who was also in the plane at the time because they were on one of the lessons in flight school. And what not having, military status means is that you have women who are not only disappointed. So in this case, this is a WASP who is talking about how, we were really sad when Congress didn't grant us military status because we were living in it and we'd been through training and then all our different assignments. And she said, it's all we talked about. And suddenly, in a few days' time, here you are, completely nothing. It's such a transition we have to go through afterwards. I mean, to this day, all I have to do is hear a plane go overhead, and I'm right with that pilot up there. And this reflects the, demoralized feeling that the WASP had by not being granted military status, and the fact that a lot of these women, they wanted to have not only aviation careers, but also those in the military. And so this is a failed opportunity. I make several arguments in my book about why Congress votes not to grant these women military status. One of those reasons is because of the media's portrayal of them. There was one journalist in particular who called them a quote lipstick squadron, which I thought really encapsulates kind of the heart of the media coverage of them. This is from a Life magazine article. So on the left, you see the cover. So the WASP did make the cover of Life in 1943, July. The image on the right is one of the pictures from the inside of this magazine article. So because it is a cover issue, it's, getting attention. There's a wide reader subscription of Life magazine. And in this, the WASP are portrayed primarily at leisure in this cover issue. So like the image that you see on the right, they had very few moments of downtime and leisure, but those were the photos that the journalists chose to portray. And so I make arguments about how the media portrayal made Congress not take them as seriously as professionals. It also meant that Congress ignored the arguments of General Arnold, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, other top military and government officials who said, please, grant the WASP military status. We organized them as such. We planned to give them, that status. And so don't waste taxpayer dollars and, keep this program. But Congress chose to listen to the voices, not just of the media, but some others that I get into in the book, and voted not to grant them military status. And so what the WASP do is, like Roger said earlier, they feel devastated. And so when you look at the post-war years, they make conversation at their annual reunions where they say, like, it really would be nice if we had veteran status, but they don't make a large, concentrated, organized effort for this for a couple decades. So once you see the 1960s come around in this era of a lot of moments happening historically, but including the forthcoming like civil rights movement, you see women's liberation coming. In that moment, the WASP make these arguments and discussion about how we'd like to seriously try to get a bill before Congress. One of the people who helped them with that was General Arnold during World War II's son, who in this picture is Colonel Bruce Arnold. So in this meeting that you see here, you see some of the WASP actually in their uniforms, some just dressed professionally. they are making a large organized effort to fight for their rights to military status, to veteran status in this moment. So what this means is that if they're granted it, they will have access to medical benefits with the VA, with access to military funerals. For a lot of the women, they want this because of the 38 women who died during the war, and they want them to see them get respect because during World War II, those women, in a lot of cases, their families had to pay to ship their bodies home. They did not have access to the GI Bill after World War II for the other WASP, and they also didn't have the right for military funerals, either even for the 38 who died during the war. And so they wanted that recognition and status. And so when they're like fighting for this in the 1970s, especially what you see happen is Congress starts to debate like who has the right to the title like veteran. And some of the things that they talk out, which I talk about extensively in the book, is that these women are saying we were organized as military, we basically were military, we just didn't get it from Congress. And so they present their case. And these veterans in Congress, like some veterans say, yeah, we support them because they were a part of our military service, or we recognize the WASP, or some of the veterans said like, no, we shouldn't grant them veteran status because this will mean that other groups, other civilian groups will try to get veteran status. And it will, some people had very dramatic comments to make about it, including the national level VFW and American Legion, where they said, we don't think that these women should get veteran status because it will forever change the term veteran. Like it won't mean the same thing anymore. And so they literally situate themselves as stakeholders of this term and say that, you know, this isn't just, a Pandora's box, as one of them says, but we need to like keep a tight grasp on veteran and keep the meaning that it currently has. And I find that conversation to be really fascinating because it speaks to ideas that even now the American public has when you say the word veteran, where people often think like a woman, or they think someone who fought in combat. These women, just like other women during World War II, did not fight in combat, but who otherwise, fit this like definition, even in like popular memory, right? And so the discussions around it are like fascinating to think about. The WASP end up getting veteran status, and so it's signed into law in 1977. They receive other recognition in 2010 when they received the Congressional Gold Medal. That is not the end of their story. I talk in the epilogue of my book about how there are other times where they have to fight for their right to this title veteran, even though they've been granted it officially through law. One of the examples I look at is of a WASP who is trying to get interned in Arlington National Cemetery in 2016. And so even though they get veteran status, just like other female veterans, they often feel invisible from the American public. So thank you so much. That completes the overview section. We're going to do questions in a second, but I wanted to thank Dr. Tanya Roth for this conversation, and we're now going to turn it over to a discussion.
Excellent. Oh, that was so interesting, Sarah. I mean, as you know, I know the story, but hearing you talk about it after having read your book and hearing you talk about the things that you particularly found interesting and the people that drew you in part to pieces of the project, it just brings such a new dimension to it that I am so fascinated in it. One of the things that I find so interesting is that I work with women outside of the women who are mostly not pilots for the most part. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that the women that I look at after World War II in the Women's Army Corps and even the women in the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines, those are women who during World War II would not have had such a specialized background as women who are pilots. So a lot of the women who come into like the Women's Army Corps in the early 40s, for example, they've got lots of skills, but being pilots is something that's not in their skill set. So you've got such a fascinating group of women. I was so surprised to hear when you started telling this story in the book about how maybe not widespread, but like the number of women who had become pilots in the first half of the 20th century. Could you talk more about this to us? Tell us more about the flying that women engaged in before World War II, and how was flying perceived, like women flying planes perceived by the general public?
Thank you. So, thinking about these early decades of flight, like after the Wright brothers, there are women who are, just as excited about aviation as men in the same era. A lot of Americans didn't hear about the airplane, and it took a long time, depending on the area in which you lived. Some people had never seen an airplane, but for the women who become pilots in this era, they all talk about how they view flight as a space of liberation for women. That when you think about American society, we see a future for women in the skies. And what is fascinating about that to me is these women are flying in, the 1920s, 30s, in an era where you have like the modern girl that everyone thinks of with the flapper and these other expanding ideas. And a lot of these early women pilots situate themselves like that modern girl. They talk about adventure and a sense of liberation from constraints of society. But they also see flying as like a future career for women and like a possibility. To me, it's very similar to the ways that women in like early US history talk about the bicycle and what that did for them in terms of, freedom of mobility and movement and possibility. And when they're describing flights, I just love reading their accounts. It's kind of like the Cornelia Fort quote that I used because they just are they just love being in the sky, and they love that like experience of flight and the way that it makes them feel and the way that it makes them perceive the world. And these are the women who either become the wasp or who inspire the wasp to fly. And so even though we know of like Amelia Earhart, right, because she's the one who's always thrown around, the woman who became the director of the WASP program, Jackie Cochran, Nancy Love, who also had a leadership position with the Fairing Division. Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran should be just as like well known by Americans because they were just as, and in Jackie Cochran's case, like more accomplished than Amelia Earhart as pilots. And so, yeah, it's like this whole culture that's happening and unfolding in the years prior to World War II.
It's so fascinating. And I confess, I was never someone growing up who looked at flying or even astronauts and went, "Ooh!" I never personally saw the allure of. I mean, I love going on planes. Don't get me wrong, but I never saw that allure of being a pilot or becoming an astronaut, which I know a lot of kids do. Right? When you're growing up, the number of times you hear a kid say, "I want to be an astronaut or a pilot," right? So it's really neat. I love the passages. I think one of my favorite quotes is one of the items you use as a title for chapter 2, which I believe you say it's not from a wasp, but it was adopted by the wasp. We live in the wind and sand, and our eyes are on the stars. And just that, I really get that glimpse of why this is so captivating to people. It's really cool to see. And I think I understand it a little bit better as a passion that people would have. Um, I also, I mean, I think of today, I feel like I always had this perception as a non-pilot that it's expensive to get flying lessons. Is it different in the years before World War II? I would imagine there's still probably access barriers to some people, but were there different opportunities, or how did that work for people to get access to learning how to fly?
There were obstacles just like there are today. So I actually also am not a pilot, and I looked into it because I thought, I would like to be closer to my subjects and learn learn how to fly. It is very expensive now, and it was very expensive then. A lot of women who learned how to fly, they either came from money, like the Cornelia Fort who I mentioned, or they negotiated for flying lessons. So they would say, I'll volunteer at the airport and do whatever it is that you need me to do if I could get like this many flying hours. Or will you teach me if I, do these like chores for you over here? And so they would just like exchange basically work for flying. Some of the women took jobs in, once they'd negotiated and then were like, I want this as a profession, but I don't have money for it. They would take jobs in like air shows and kind of like air shows we have now where people would perform. And so women would get, paid like men to fly in these air shows to perform stunts for the public so that people could see, exciting things that airplanes could do. And then what you see happen is in the 1930s, as war is unfolding around the world, we have a new government program in the New Deal in 1939 that offers women, one woman for every 10 men, the opportunity to get pilot's license for free. And so that's how you get actually the WASP program possible, where you have like over 1,000 women who become the WASP. That's only really made possible in that scale from this New Deal government program that was called the Civilian Pilot Training Program. So women got the opportunity to get their foot. The same thing with men, and same thing with the Tuskegee Airmen specifically. Their Black men are getting the experience of flight from this New Deal government program as well. And so groups that have been historically marginalized or who don't have access to resources because of their class status, now all of a sudden it becomes possible for you. Again, not for everyone, because there's only a small number of people who can invest in this and have the time, but it becomes more possible for people who aren't wealthy to learn how to fly. And since you mentioned it, I did want to say that the WASP program in particular is a program that is for white women and women who are perceived as white. So when we're talking about pilots during World War II or women's military service, some of the branches, admit women, Black women specifically in the Jim Crow military, but for the WASP, they do not. So they only accept women who can like pass as white, which I know is kind of a tangent to what you were saying, but I wanted to be sure I said it.
I was wondering that too. I was thinking about that. Is there I feel like I'm gonna get the name wrong. Hazel Ming Lee, at
Yeah.
least one Asian
Usually
American
mean,
woman.
yeah. Yeah, so
Yeah.
she in particular was Chinese American, and her, like, she has this extensive backstory, but essentially what's interesting about it to me is that women had to have face-to-face interviews, and women who were Black were filtered out from the program and were literally told, like, we're sorry, but because of your race, we're not accepting you because we're worried about the program being too controversial. But she in particular is misidentified on a farm when she is a trainee, and she has like an accident in this and has to make a forced landing into this farm, and the farmer thinks that she's Japanese because we've been fighting with the Japanese in the Pacific. And so even though she's Chinese American, there's this moment where he is like not making this false assumption about her based on her appearance. And so it's interesting to me because the program as a whole is saying, we have this like specific image, but yet there's also some women who are Native American, who identify with different tribes who are in the WASP. There's also some women who are Hispanic. I assume that it's possible that there's women that I didn't even find, because in the historical record, unless these women were interviewed like decades later, or there's some discussion of them, like, this farm incident, there's just really not a lot in the sources to say anything about the women's race or ethnicity.
That is so fascinating. And that story of being mistaken I can imagine the farmer making that mistake based on his own assumptions and prejudices at the time. And that's really interesting that they didn't want the program to be controversial. And yet it's still, I mean, it sounds like whatever they were going to do was going to be controversial in some ways.
Yes.
But yeah, as you said, similarly in the Women's Army Corps, uh, the 6888 is the only African American women's unit that goes overseas with the Women's Army Corps. And there's only very small numbers of Black women in the Navy, and I don't believe any in the Marines until after
Yeah.
the war,
Yeah.
or very, very small numbers. So it's fascinating. Um, so if you had to predominantly be white in order to apply, and you talked about how the civilian pilot training program helped get some of the people who would become WASPs. How exactly did the WASP program start after that, as the war began, and how could a woman apply to be part of it?
The program started actually in the years prior to the war, which shout out to the National Archives for helping me find some specific letters that I was trying to track down about this. So Jackie Cochran had, written to the Army Air Force and said, Army Air Corps at the time, and said, "Hey, I'm a female pilot, very experienced. I know other very experienced female pilots. When we get involved in the war in Europe, we would love to be a part of this." There's no other discussions that like are had except, no, thanks for your like interest, but we're not going to do that. Nancy Love has connections in the military through her husband, and so she actually also contacts and says, "Hey, same thing. I'm an experienced pilot. I know others. we would love for you to use us. So then the war starts in Europe in 1939, and Cochrane and Love have continued conversations, but they're just told no. After we declare war in, December 1941, in the spring of 1942, this is when the Army Air Force starts to think seriously about using American women on the home front as pilots. And this is when you see discussions between General Arnold and Love and Cochrane. And eventually, Love and Cochrane are given two separate pilot programs, one with Nancy Love, that's very experienced pilots. There's only 28 of them. They literally have thousands of flying hours. They are almost all, women of wealth and means because they were able to acquire that many flying hours. And then you have Nancy Love, or excuse me, Jackie Cochran, who starts a program for women who are going to have much fewer flying hours. The level or the number changes, during the course of the war, but not thousands of hours. So Jackie Cochran, this is when she organizes the program to get military training in Texas for the women and plans out this whole thing about new and expanding roles that women can have in assignments. Whereas Nancy Love focuses her group just on ferrying planes specifically and not new roles. And so the Army Air Force decides to merge the programs under Cochran's directorship. So they don't have rank because they weren't granted military status. So that's why I'm calling them, these vague terms, because they didn't have rank, but Jackie Cochran was declared the director of the program and in charge. And so she in particular is the one who really organizes all the details of training in Texas, new and expanding assignments, working with the Air Force to try to get women. Some women get officer training, so she's a part of that. And this is how women then apply. So they have women who apply who don't have flying hours because you need to have your pilot's license. And so those women all get rejected. Then from there, of the women that they accept and that go through training, the men and women, when you compare their training, because the Army Air Force conducted reports at the end of the war about this, there's the same washout rate. So washing out is when you fail training, have to go home, and don't graduate. So the same washout rate applied to both the women and the men, which was an interesting, to see those statistics for the Air Force and the effectiveness of women and how, oh, okay, even though we had stereotypes about them, and we weren't sure if they were physically capable of it or intellectually capable of it, they can fly and they're doing a great job. And so, yeah.
That's so interesting. It feels like looking at my research through the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, there's always work done on looking at women and can they actually do stuff? And yes, they can. But it's so fascinating when you see that data. And I don't know of an instance where the data from the WASP was used later on and elsewhere. Should have been, right? That's really specialized information. And especially as we move further to the 20th century and women become pilots in other parts of the military after World War II, that would be really great data to have, But also, I think that's so striking that even with all these assumptions, consistently, decade after decade, data on women show that either they perform as well as men, as you talked about with dropout rates, or even better, that their dropout rates in other parts of the military or their rates of drug use as we get into the 60s and 70s or other issues is much lower than the men. And it gets easily written off,
Yes. That's what I find fascinating about both of our works is the ways that these stereotypes just continue to perpetuate even when evidence is showing the opposite, or the
Yeah.
ways that our research shows that women will prove themselves, and then it's oh, okay, well, now that it's been, now we believe you, right? We didn't believe you at first, but we need evidence. And for the WASP in particular, they don't get to, women don't get to be flying in the military again until 1973. And
I
then
thought it was
commercial
a
airlines
while.
is actually the same year. So women
Really?
are not included into commercial or military aviation in these larger planes, right? And these different ways. So it's fascinating.
It
Yeah.
is really interesting. And so given especially the background many of these women came from, what did their families tend to think? Do they say much about their families' reactions to their decisions?
I think this is interesting in terms of the time period and gender roles and ideas that people have. WASP had varying reactions about their families. So some of the parents would say I remember in the book I map out a lot of details, but in this one example, this WASP was like, my mom was very opposed. She didn't like the stereotypes, that existed about women in the military. I mean, keep in mind, like, women are wearing pants with their military dress uniforms, with their
It's
flight suits.
shocking.
And this is shocking. Yeah, I tell this to my students all the time because I'm like, it's not commonplace for women to wear pants in public. And so that alone is shocking, much less women in the military, much less what they're doing. And so thinking about that, this WASP was like, my parents were opposed. Marty Weil is the one I'm referencing, who I showed the picture of earlier. So she's like, my mom was opposed, but my dad, he was actually like, he wasn't really excited, but he was supportive. And she's like, that's all I needed. And so she had his like support and blessing to join. And so she like, eventually becomes a WASP. But other women talk about how some of what was interesting to me was a lot of it was generational women. So it'd be like grandmas, moms who were concerned about gender roles or their daughters or perceptions of their daughters. And I think that's what I found most interesting about that side of the research was that I expected it to be more, male reactions within the family, but in fact, what I found was it was more the women in the family that were concerned about maintaining gender roles.
That is so interesting.
Mhm.
I'm fascinated by the fact, I looked at, as an undergrad, I looked at women as nurses in World War One, who often came from a pretty higher class status as well, and the work that they did. And then thinking about the women of the WASPs, um, I feel like the history we often hear is that women of a certain socioeconomic status in the United States absolutely do a lot of service, very community oriented women, people who will support war causes. But this, like, especially now, I think what's one of the things that's so interesting is that your work shows us that by the time we hit World War II, even though we don't think about it, there are absolutely women who have skills and talents that are new in so many ways, and they are directing their service into new possibilities, which is just so interesting to me. um,
Great.
during the war itself, did the WASPs have experiences that were similar to the male Army Air Force pilots? You talked about the similarity in towing targets, for example, but other experiences that were similar?
Yes. So in some instances, so similar that the WASP would be like one of the only women on base, like one of the only women pilots. There were there was a one WASP in particular who was testing jet aircraft, and she was the only one. Like she was the only WASP assigned that during the entire war. So
Wow.
in a lot of cases, these women go from I didn't mention it earlier, but training it in Texas was at an all-female base in Sweetwater. So there were male instructors, but there weren't other male pilots training there, and so they go from this situation where it's like all women pilots to being sometimes the only one, and they're stationed in roles alongside men throughout the US. So they're performing, like, literally they're flying all of the same aircraft as men. They're holding almost all the same roles that male pilots have. The only distinction is combat and flying overseas. That is, restricted to them, but otherwise they're, serving alongside male pilots, and sometimes they're the only one of a handful.
Wow. And that the field in Sweetwater, is that Avenger Field?
It is, yes.
Okay, I'm a Marvel fan, and I find it. I love the fact that the Wasps were at Avenger Field, and like women were the first Avengers. There we go.
Yeah, they
Any
were.
Marvel fans might enjoy that. So
Yes.
that's
Well,
my
they even
personal.
said in their one of their newsletters, they're like, "We're avenging men's deaths," and so I love that it like also is connected to that because that's also superhero vibes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're the total original superheroes. I really love it. So you mentioned that they do pretty much almost all the same things as men's, and you mentioned how they're sometimes even the only women on base. They would go through their training, they'd go through graduation. How did men react when they started getting these women on the Army Air Force bases?
It is a wide range of reactions, as I'm sure you might have guessed even if you hadn't read the book. So they have, in some instances, they talk about how like men would just be blatantly, like overtly. They often the WASP for the most part in oral history interviews refrain from using the term sexist, but in a way that we might use that term now, basically discriminate against them in just some overt way. Some of the WASPs say that if I proved myself and showed yes I can handle this aircraft, that I could handle, B-24 training, whatever, then they would be accepted. So they would, and it's very similar to what, you look at in your book. It's very similar to what you look at now with pilot training, even WAS or with women pilots, and the ways that they're perceived. They often feel like they have to prove themselves. And so when they're, proving themselves, they're like, oh, well, then I was accepted. But also you have instances where there was a WASP who was set to ferry, an officer across the U.S. And he's like, I'm not getting in the plane with you. And she's like, I'm the literal only one that can take you. So either we're going or you're staying here. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And so the man did get in the plane. And then afterwards, he apologized and was like, I'm sorry. You clearly are very competent. But also, they're like, people play into gender roles to give them certain assignments. So one of the assignments they had was learning to fly the B-29 and then flying demonstrations for men, because this, like, when the B-29 was developed during World War II, it had engine fire problems. So some of the early test pilots who were men had died because as a result, because they were testing out a new technology. And so the Army Air Force decides, like, oh, let's have women fly the B-29 and land it at bases, for a flying demonstration. And I bet that'll change morale. And sure enough, male pilots at these bases are like, oh, yeah, it must be easy to fly. When before they had refused to go to B-29 school and didn't want to learn. And so it's just fascinating.
All you got to do is put a woman in the cockpit and she can show you how it's done.
Yep, yep, yep.
Wow.
Which is
Wow.
literally the case, because some of the WASP did train men how to fly the B-29. So, yeah.
And it's amazing to me, all these parts of our history that I think just so easily get lost in this larger narrative we often think of. That I was thinking about when you were talking earlier, that here are women who are doing work that today would prepare you for a career. And I love that we're seeing women having these diverse experiences at a time that the general historical narrative tends to be, well, it was an anomaly. Women came out of their homes for just a little bit of time and then they went back to their homes. And these are women who I'm guessing many of them went on to have family lives and maybe other careers, but it wasn't just something they did for fun for 2 or 3 years. This is something that was really a part of who they were.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
And you talked there. We got a great question here about the accident rate, because I'm thinking about the danger they were all put in that you talked about. And one of our viewers asks, were the WASPs accident rate much lower than male pilots, largely because they read the directions and followed them?
I love that we're tapping into, like, the stereotype that I think perpetuates to today about, like, women early history in, like, cars, and then women as pilots, right? And so it's like this idea that women are paying attention to the detail and, like, following directions, etc. So the WASP in particular is in these, like, reports, because anytime there's an accident anywhere, like even overseas, like after heavy combat and chaos of war, they still do accident reports for planes, and do their best to track what happened. But if it's on the home front, it's a very detailed accident report where they're like, this is literally the reason why the plane crashed, and there's like all these categories and descriptions and things. In those, like, accidents, when it's discussed, what's interesting to me is that they are, like, because there's all these stereotypes about women, and their abilities. And even General Arnold says at a literal graduation for the WASP, like in a graduation ceremony, he says, I didn't know whether the slip of a young girl could handle the controls of a B-17, you know? And so in these accident reports, what's interesting about it is it just becomes very clear to them, like, oh, well, they're like able to handle this like as a skill. And the argument that I use is that I think that they have better accident reports is because they are wanting to prove themselves. And so kind of like the Tuskegee Airmen, right? Like they know that if they mess up at all, that people are just going to, write them off and say, well, this is why women can't be pilots, and this is why, they shouldn't fly this type of aircraft. And so they really, really were driven to succeed, but also prove themselves. So it's a great question. Thank you.
I love that. And could you take us back to, I'm always personally very struck by the number of women who died in their service to their country in the WASPs, and the fact that because they were classified as civilian, the inequity of the benefits. So, for example, you had the memorial to the one woman who died, and then also the notice of her instructor who died. So we have there two deaths, right? One woman, one man, and I'm assuming the man had full military status in that case. What would the difference look like? You mentioned that families had to pay to ship their daughter's bodies home, for example, in some cases. What would a male pilot get in such a circumstance that one of the WASPs would not get, for example?
So what would happen is you get access to military benefits for your family. So that covers the cost of your like funeral service and things like that. But it's also supposed to be compensation for like loss to your family. There also during World War II, there were stars you could display in your window, and the gold star in particular was the one that represented that you had someone that served in the military who died. And so the blue star represents like service. And so the families were not supposed to display a gold star for a WASP, whereas if it was a male pilot, that is displayed. But also for like the funeral itself, they were told that they were not, like their families were told that they are not allowed to have, not only can you not be buried at a military cemetery or inurned at Arlington, but also you can't have those like honors, right? The folding of the flag, those little ceremonial aspects that are given in memory for people. You aren't supposed to have access to all of that. Even what's interesting is like for the WASP who did not die, they had to use their civilian medical insurance when they had accidents. So there's some strange like insurance filings during World War II because one woman got a like infection from someone who had been serving in the China Burma India theater, and he was in her plane, and she was flying a cargo plane. So it's like really freak thing that isn't normal, and then just use her for civilian insurance for that. And so things just got like very complicated, even just for the regular WASP who didn't die.
Wow. Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, we have another question from one of our audience members asking, can you speak about the rumors amongst the WASP about sabotage at Camp Davis?
Yes, great question. So Camp Davis in particular is where the one of the places where the WASP towed targets in like the largest number of WASP towed targets there. They were um, there were actually a couple other incidences that I found outside of Camp Davis, but what this viewer is like referencing is that there were instances of sugar being placed in tanks, like so they would essentially like what they were trying to do. The person that was doing this was trying to sabotage your plane in a way that it would either cause you to crash or also potentially die. And so I found incidences at there's a bunch at Camp Davis. There are others. David Stallman actually wrote a book about towing targets at Camp Davis. He's a journalist that talks about that specifically and goes into a lot of detail if you want like a lot of detail about those. But I could never find a like because there weren't investigations of this, I could never find a blame for specific mechanic names or who this might have been. And so all I can do is speculate about it and say that it's possible that the people were antagonistic against them as women, right, in the military, even though they're mechanics and not pilots that are working on these planes and that are potentially doing this. Of course, it could be someone else, but mechanics are the last ones to go over the plane beyond the pilot. And so, you would think that they would catch it. And then the other thing is that like there were pro-German like sympathizers. And so the other thought is that potentially, because I found one account where someone thought maybe that's who was doing it. So there's also this idea that maybe it was someone who was like a pro-German sympathizer. And these incidents of sabotage, though, were representative of the fact that regardless, there's antagonism against their like military service.
And the mechanics in this case, would they have been military mechanics?
So it depended. So actually, I was going to say that earlier about the wasp that I showed and her instructor who died. So some of the instructors on base were civilian and some were military. And so actually, same thing with mechanics. Most of the mechanics were military, but no one has done a really extensive history, tragically, of the support staff for including mechanics. And so it's unclear like whether or not they would have been like civilian or military, but more
Oh, that's
likely
interesting.
military. Yeah.
Okay, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Another question that we have is from your research, were you able to identify their successful approaches to overturning institutionalized or systemic prejudice?
Yeah, great question. So thinking about it, I was looking at like different ways that the WASP even like framed or talked about their like service, because when they're like fighting for military status during the 1970s, they often don't, like I said, use the language of like sexism or male chauvinism or things like that. Um, but there were instances where the WASP during the war would talk about the discrimination they faced, and they would talk about it in a way where they kind of like what Jackie Cochran had addressed to them, which is that we want this program to be successful. So even in these instances of sabotage, we're not going to fully investigate this because we want to keep the program going, and we're worried about controversy, and we're worried about people questioning what we're doing and questioning you in dangerous roles. And so during World War II, the WASP did not in any strong, like organized way, combat this prejudice that they face. There were individual WASP who talk about, like, oh, when I was at Sweetwater, there was this one instructor who was known for really hating women, and he was resentful about this, like a military assignment that he'd been given. And so he would like take the control stick, because the instructor in the back of the plane could take the over the control I can't talk control stick, and then would like manipulate it so that it would go back and forth and like hit her like in between her thighs, and so it bruised her thighs. And so she's like, but I didn't feel like I could say anything because I was worried that like I wouldn't get to graduate. And so there were all these like examples. And even when Congress was debating in 1944, Cochrane asked the WASP, like, please don't join in on the debates. Don't do interviews with the media. We've got this. Like Arnold's in charge of it. He's going to talk to Congress. You don't need to get involved with this fight. This is not your fight. And so the WASP don't get involved there either.
So interesting. I see that strategy, and yet I'm like, these are women who clearly were doing such impressive work. And this, I think, is one of the really so. Oh, there might be some WASP members in the audience as well that we might have as well. Another question: can you talk about why the WASP program info was classified and unavailable to historians after the war? That's a great question.
Yeah, so even among the like WASP when they were training and while they were in their military service and leaving military service, a lot of them were told to keep it quiet. So even in their like communities, people didn't know. When you think about like even like training and trainees returning home who washed out, that kind of thing, people, the American public largely doesn't know about them. Even though there is that Life magazine article, the memory of them like is lost, right, in the shuffle of just everything else happening during World War II. And so a lot of WASPs talk about how their memories are forgotten. But similar to what's been done with Women's Army Corps records and other women's military records, when women are placed in roles that are considered to be, non-traditional, or that are potentially controversial, or they think, this might be disruptive to the public in some way, they will like seal those records for a certain period of time, or, sometimes indefinitely, potentially, we don't know. But there were examples of this with the Women's Army Corps and how they shot anti-aircraft artillery off the coast of the US as like practice exercises, but they didn't think that the American public should know about women firing guns, right? And so I think that it has to do with their controversial nature of the program, and wanting it to be successful. And then the ramification of that is that then a lot of people don't hear about them afterwards, or they're largely forgotten.
So thinking even about the legacy, then what before thinking about that, I think what's so significant in your book is this fight for veteran status, this question of who's a veteran. I was just so fascinated by this in your book. Could you talk more about why the women fought for this campaign to get military status? It's clearly important to them, and I think you and I both agree it's very important that this happened as well, that they were recognized officially as a veteran. Why do you think they were successful at the time? Why did they find it so important at that time to do it?
Yeah, so they, at that point in time, there were a lot of things happening in the media, not just with like other social movements, but also there are in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, because I said 1973 is like women's reintroduction into military flight. Some WASPs say like what that motivated them was they read newspaper accounts that said the first women fly for the U.S. military and are in training. she was like, hello, and so some WASPs did for like that reason for recognition, but also a lot of them just talked about how, they're they're getting not towards the end of their lives, but a moment where they're thinking about that and thinking about the future and are like, it would be really nice to have this benefit. And a lot of them identified as military and saw themselves specifically as veterans. And it bothered them that they couldn't take that like term and use that identity. And, one WASP in particular was like, I was so, you know, my husband was a pilot, like he was buried with military honors. Like I would so love for that to be me, right? Like, so this discussion of how you want that um, recognition and identity, but also sometimes you just want that recognition and identity for your friends, like of the 38 who died during the war.
I'm so glad that they did because I think it's a fight that obviously very important to them, but thinking larger picture that, as you said, they're seeing articles about women becoming the first pilots, and also it's the decade we get the first women generals in the different branches of the military. We get the first women admitted to the military academies a couple years later in '76. 73 is the end of the draft and the creation of the all volunteer forces, and it's like this decade where everything really seems to hit a fever pitch in there. And my sense from reading your work and hearing you talk about it is that if not for the work these women did to make that statement and to claim that status, that I think that also helped other women who have also served and been veterans. And it really solidifies that, maybe that I think it's very possible that even for women in the Women's Army Corps who did have military status during the war, that it's been easy for people to think, well, they're not really veterans either. So I really think this is such an important moment to say, yes, women are veterans, and here's what this means.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that context too, because I think that ties our work together really well. Yeah.
I think this question of who's a veteran is so huge, and I really love it. But what do you think, as we close this out for today, what aspects of the history of the WASP do you think are most relevant, and what larger legacies should we take away from this?
One is that I think that we should really think about what and how we like treat our veterans and like what as a nation we owe veterans, because oftentimes there's discussion about, like I said earlier, about even who's remembered as a veteran. And even now there are women who have gone to the VA and the VA assumes that their husband is the veteran, so they just seem like some sort of forgotten population that we like need to remember. Also, because I've been asked by people in the media before, oh, name a female veteran that all Americans would know. And I'm like, I don't know if all Americans would know that sort of thing. But also, I think it's a larger legacy of like um, thinking about women trying to prove themselves and other groups who've had to prove themselves. And the fact that there are all these stereotypes that continue to perpetuate to even through today for women's different roles that they're assuming in the military. Anytime there's any slight change, these a wave of stereotypes come back, whether that be through the American public or through the media's like questioning of women and their roles and not focusing on them as professionals. So I would love to see more of that.
Absolutely. We have one last question before we wrap up today. Could you talk briefly about the 1977 Year of the WASP campaign and the 2010 Congressional Gold Medal campaign?
Yeah, sure. So in the interest of time, I'll be really fast about 77 and say like the book will be more extensive for you. But this is like the year that it's signed into law and the WASP were officially granted this like veteran status. In 2010, the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony was really fascinating because this is like the highest like civilian honor for the U.S. government. And so in this like ceremony, the Tuskegee Airmen had been given it 3 years before, so it kind of felt like a continuation of this like thank you for your service, but also in particular, thank you for your service because we forgot you for so long and didn't even give you military status. So I think it really represents all of those things.
So, well, thank you so much, Professor Myers. This has been wonderful. Love chatting with you, and thank you for everything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roth. I really appreciate your time in this conversation. And thanks
Thank
again
you
to
all
the
for
National
being with
Archive.
us. Yes.